What's up guys, LeopoldTheBrave here, talking about Crash Bandicoot for the first time in, honestly, quite a while. Well, except for last week when I did Crash Bandicoot vs. Stitch, which you should check out. But you know what I mean, talking about the actual series. So recently, a discussion opened up, a small one, but still something interesting to talk about, regarding Crash's relevance in his own game, Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. Now, I already said what I thought of the story back when the game first came out. I thought it was fun and pretty good. The humor was great, I loved the handling of Cortex and especially the handling of Dingodile, and it was great to see Oxide again, and I liked that twist of them going back to the past before the events of the first game. But I also pointed out some notable flaws, like the poor handling of the Tawna situation despite how cool her alternate universe version is, and the poor handling of the continuity, where they contradicted the original trilogy by having Brio on Cortex's side again for some reason, and contradicted the post-Naughty Dog games by having nothing that sets up to them. And then finally the poor handling of Crash's character, which is the topic of today's video. In Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, Crash feels like a side character in his own game. Throughout the entire story, Crash does absolutely nothing until he occasionally gets a few seconds to make a silly face or hurt himself, while Coco does all the talking and plot stuff. Now, characters talking for Crash, even specifically Coco, isn't the problem at all. Crash can't speak, of course he has to have characters talk for him. I'll go more in depth in a bit, but the problem comes from Crash 4's writing itself. Crash is pretty much reduced to a visual gag machine who doesn't really do anything to forward the plot except for right at the beginning when he discovers Lani Loli, but that's only because Aku Aku tells him to go. Now, this is nothing new, it's actually pretty similar to the original trilogy. The original 3 Naughty Dog games would open up on several minutes of Cortex shenanigans before we even get to see Crash. Cortex does something bad, Aku Aku explains the plot and tells him to go, and Crash just sits there doing a funny. But the reason it could be excused in these games and not Crash 4 is because these games have an extremely simple story. There's not really anything to be done besides being the hero and saving the day. But in Crash 4, it's a bit more complex, reuniting all the quantum masks, reuniting all your friends across dimensions, reforming Cortex, that plot twist. Instead of the plot being driven by Crash's cartoony antics like it was in the original trilogy, now it just kind of moves on its own and has to drag Crash along with it, sometimes literally. In fact, at one point, the story even goes out of its way to prevent Crash from doing something plot relevant in favor of developing the character arc of their very cool and original Bandicoot Sona who stole Tawna's name. So if it's Crash 4's writing itself that's the problem and not the fact that characters are talking for Crash or that there's a more complex story, then what's an example of it being done correctly? For that, let's take a look at everyone's favorite game, Crash Twinsanity. Now, this isn't going to be me mercilessly bashing Crash 4 and making out with Twinsanity. I fully acknowledge Twinsanity's flaws, the unfocused gameplay, all the glitches and lack of polish, and so on and so forth. But as far as the story goes, it did a very good job at keeping Crash important in a game that wasn't really about him. Crash Twinsanity was very much the Cortex game. And yet Crash was still 100 times more important here than he was in Crash 4 and had 100 times the stuff to do. Through the entirety of the game, it's Crash's job to rescue Cortex and also keep him close to make sure that Cortex corrects his past mistake with the evil twins and fixes everything. Then there's some isolated incidents, like going to Ingen's battleship or Nina's classrooms to get some crystals, or being the one to think of getting Mecha Bandicoot to defeat the final boss. In fact, the most iconic scene in what should be called Cortex the video game is about Crash thinking of something to forward the plot when Cortex gets stuck. And this moment isn't interchangeable with Coco either. If she was standing right there, nothing would have happened in this scene. Only Crash could have come up with something so absurd. And that's honestly 100 times more than Crash 4's story ever came close to doing. Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant actually did a pretty good job with this too, with Aku Aku instead of Cortex, but Crash also spoke gibberish there and could kinda be understood by other characters, so it was cheating technically. But hopefully you get my point. Now though, you may be thinking, well, it worked out when Cortex talked for Crash, and it worked out when Aku Aku talked for Crash, so Coco must be the problem. I mean, you can play all of Crash 4 as her with the exception of 2 levels right at the beginning. She's overshadowing her brother, it's her fault. But no, that is not the case either, it's just Crash 4's writing. To prove this point, let's take a look at another game where Coco had a bigger presence than usual but still didn't overshadow Crash. And that game is Crash Nitro Kart. In Nitro Kart, you can play through the entire story start to finish as Coco, or even Crunch, without touching Crash once. Crash 4 at least forces you to play as Crash for the first 2 levels, and yet Nitro Kart still does a better job at keeping Crash as the main character, even while still using Coco plenty. Crunch gets some spotlight too, it's even his best appearance in my opinion. So, in the Nitro Kart story, Crash gives a gift to Krunk, the first boss, Coco helps restrain Nash, the second boss when he throws a fit over losing, and Crunch befriends the third boss, Norm. Then they each have their own little interactions with Velo. Crunch delivers the one-liners and intimidation to get Velo to do what they want, Coco calls out his unfairness, and in the end, it's Crash's decision to show mercy, letting Velo keep ruling as long as he leaves other planets alone. So despite Crunch and Coco having important roles too, and sharing the same amount of spotlight as Crash, they still do a good job at making Crash the main character. Crash is the first one to befriend a boss. He gets a little fun visual gag with Geary, whose cutscene is more focused on Geary itself rather than any of the Bandicoots. And he is the one who makes the big decision in the end regarding Velo. It's probably the most underrated story mode in a Crash game in my opinion. I love it. So yeah, now you get my point. You can have characters speaking for Crash. You can have Coco be just as important as Crash. You can have multiple characters playable to the point where Crash is completely optional. You can have a game that's not even about Crash and still do an excellent job at reminding everyone that yes, he is in fact the main character. Crash being unable to speak doesn't really matter, it's all about execution, and unfortunately Crash 4 failed in that regard. I know it's not fun to talk bad about Crash 4 because it's the newest one, so you want to say good things about it to prove you like it, and so they'll make more. But you've got to learn how to criticize the things you love so they can do even better next time. I want Crash to be a main character in Crash 5. But yeah, it was just an interesting little discussion I wanted to make a video about. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Did Crash 4 have enough Crash for you? Which game had your favorite portrayal of Crash's character? I'll be sure to check out your responses and I'll see you guys next time. Leopold the Brave, out.